Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Ontario Landowners Conference 2019. This morning we had the annual general meeting as well. My name is Jeff Bogarts, for those who do not know me. And I'm going to speak as little as I possibly can right now because we have a special guest speaker who we have imported from the United States, Tom DeWeese. For those who don't know him, you will know him by the time he's finished speaking. He'll be around for a while. There's books, there's documents he has available. He'll sign those books for you. Don't leave without documentation if you would like some. So that's all I would like to say at this point in time. You haven't come here to hear me talk, you've come here to hear Tom talk. So we're going to turn this over to Tom, and we'll all be here for questions as long as possible, but let's get Tom up here and tell us what's happening down in the States.
Thank you, sir. You get through there? Step over. I love technology.
Tom, do you want the mic stand right beside there?
No, this is fine. This is fine. Now I control the mic. I want to thank you very much. I'm honored that so many of you are here today, and so many great conversations I've had with so many of you all today and yesterday as well. And I want to say, I was listening to some of your meeting, your conversation this morning, and I want to tell you, you guys are right on. The attitude that you have, the spirit that you have, and the tactics that you are working on. I'm really pleased with what I heard this morning. And I want to tell you that everything that you're working on is exactly the same as in the United States. They change the names once in a while, some of the players a little different. It's exactly the same tactics and exactly the same goals. And so, you know, this is what we're up against. What I want to do today is maybe give you another little difference in a way to look at this and understand this agenda that we're facing here is so massive and it's so difficult to wrap your head around it that so many people give up. And they can't focus. They can't, concentrate on it because something else comes up. And so I want to give you another little way to look at it and how to think about these things. But the number one thing I want to leave with you here today with you is do not stop. Do not ever stop going to those meetings and stop putting on the pressure. You've got to make them feel pain because so many places that I go across our country, and I have people say, well, we tried this. It didn't work. We tried. And I said, how many times were you there? Well, once, but it didn't work. Of course it didn't. They're sitting there looking at their watch saying, okay, they're gone. Now let's move on. Keep that in mind. Keep the pressure on. And we're working on new things. I'm hoping will help you as well as it's helping some of the activists in the U.S., but we've got to keep fighting. But let me just say this. These things you think about. Free enterprise, individualism, private property. These three things encompass all of the principles of freedom. Take any one of them away, and freedom begins to diminish. Free enterprise, individualism, private property. These three truths of life define you as a unique individual, free to engage in commerce and benefit from the fruits of your own personal labor. And they provide you with the direct path to building personal wealth and a life of your own. Free enterprise, individualism, and private property. But now, and I know you felt this, simply defending these vital principles of freedom subject you to attack on television, in the newspaper, at any public gathering, in any discussion, even among friends. It's a feeling of mistrust, of nervousness, suspicion, even rage being thrown at you. Mostly, it's been just under the surface, but more and more, it's bubbling to the top. Political debate is breaking into an outright war. You just say the words, I don't believe the government should do that, and the war is on. Take a side, feel the heat. Tolerance is a thing of the past. There's an all-out, vicious attack on anyone who doesn't respond properly. ridicule, intimidation, public shunning, destruction of careers, removal from public meetings, all await those who express thoughts outside the politically correct box. Well, climate change skeptics are scientists who have gone beyond the hype and conducted their own personal research and made their own findings. That's what scientists do. Gee, golly. Well, for their efforts, they've been fired, discarded, blocked from receiving grants, banned from publications, and threatened. They've even compared they've compared them to Holocaust deniers. They've called them nuts, crazy, and dangerous. Some in power have even called for Nuremberg-style trials, public trials, to present such men of science as enemies of humanity, simply because they disagree with official government reports that are proving more and more to be wrong in the first place. Why? Why the hatred? Why the venom? Why the intolerance in what used to be called a personal opinion or, gee golly, political debate? The fact is, we are witnessing an all-out drive to impose thought control that seeks to ban the ability, the right to think or speak for oneself. Thinking is becoming a crime. There are forces around the world who want total power to dictate their agenda, and they will not stop. They'll stop at nothing to achieve it. For them, there is no compromise. That's something you've got to remember. There's no polite discussion or differences of opinion. The wants, the needs, the desires of your life, your family, your home are not to be considered. For revealing these facts, I've been labeled a conspiracy theorist, a nut, a domestic terrorist. The Southern Poverty Law Center has done 4 separate reports on me. I operate a hate group, you understand. And I really hate what they think, so maybe they're right. But all I have ever done is quote them. I'm not creative enough to come up with this stuff on my own. I just quote them. And the details aren't hard to find. You just look into the UN's report on global governance, in Agenda 21, in various programs of UNESCO, like its International Baccalaureate program, which teaches global citizenship in a global village, and in the Biodiversity Treaty, the Kyoto Global Warming Accord, and in the Cap and Trade Initiative. All of these policies are blatant in their intent. Top-down control, no sovereign independent nations, no individual thought, no private property, and no self-defense, no morality, no personal pride of achievement, no questions. Anything that goes against the plan, anything that would cause anyone to hesitate in moving toward the agenda must be eliminated or neutralized. Educate, indoctrinate, intimidate. Above all, destroy reason and control the ability to think. The real question, for which we must all learn the answer, is how are they really doing this? How have they gotten free sovereign nations created over the ideals of individual liberty, limited government, and free markets to accept this tyranny, to voluntarily accept it? Well, you know, a few years ago, I found the answer. And I wrote about it, believing that now I was arming our movement with the ammunition we needed to fight back. But that article was met with a resounding thud. Nobody really copied it, spread it, put it out there. Was it too intellectual, perhaps? Too academic? People want red meat. They want names. They want numbers of the culprits. They want to keep it simple. I'm constantly being told, well, your articles can't be more than about 3 paragraphs because people don't have the attention span to read all this other stuff. As soon as you do that, you have accommodated them to make sure nobody thinks about anything, because in 3 paragraphs you can't say much more than, hi, guess what, you got a problem. Well, now that we've moved so much closer to fulfillment of their agenda, now that tyranny can be more clearly found in almost every aspect of our lives, perhaps now is the time to try again. Ask yourselves this question. When did the ability to think rational thought become replaced by zombie-like programmed responses? Where do these ideas come from? Believe it or not, there is an organization, part of the UN, of course, whose purpose is to define what we are allowed to think. Its process is called globally acceptable truth. Keep that in mind. Globally acceptable truth. The organization that is pushing this is called the Eden Institute. Like the Garden of Eden, you know? The Eden Institute, and the head is a man named Donald Sager. He's a representative to the United Nations Association for World Education. He is dangerous to you and me because he has written the blueprint on thought control and is now enlisting the self-proclaimed leaders of the world to enforce it. Mr. Sager sent me an email on a quiet Sunday afternoon to disagree with some of my articles dealing with global warming. Like an idiot, I responded, so then I got more. His first line told me everything I needed to know about Mr. Sager's value system. The email begins, "Science aside." Obviously, Mr. Sager didn't want to be bothered by mere science when he had loftier goals in mind. But he went on to say, "It is inherently illogical and otherwise irresponsible to suggest that human activity does not possess the potential to alter the Earth's climate." What he's saying is, no matter what science tells us, I feel that man is damaging the Earth, and I insist that it be true. Thank you very much. We now have 12-year-olds telling us that. Incredibly, he then argued with obvious horror that, quote, energy usage worldwide is increasing at an alarming rate of speed as third world countries continue to modernize. Don't miss the completely astonishing rationale of his statement. First of all, he believes that people in third world countries are simply animals who should always live in mud huts, walk 5 miles a day for their filthy water, and cook over the quaint campfire in the center of the village. Because you see, that is good for the environment. But there's more. He says, quote, because of advances in technology, everyone in the world is now at similar risk, rich and poor alike. See, he believes that science is only a force of destruction. And that's why Mr. Sager advocates that all technological advances must first be approved by a higher authority, safely out of the hands of individuals. But fear not. Sager's Eden Project, he says, can define our problems on Earth and fix them. And here is how Donald Sager defines the problem. Quote, because of the relentless increase in the quantity and complexity of knowledge in the world, we are experiencing a clash between cultures that prevents all but the most capable of surviving with any meaningful identity intact. You catch that? The reason we have wars, poverty, and strife is because there is too much knowledge. Based on that premise, Sager then set out to create the blueprint to define acceptable ideas and thoughts that would bring harmony to the world. That leaves no room for new ideas or innovation, because new ideas can change, causing confusion, shifts in living conditions, and unemployment as old industries die to make way for new ones. So instead, we must set up a system of thought control. Central ideas are the only ones safe to think. Globally acceptable truth. And there must be a top-down control to assure bad thoughts are controlled and obliterated. And this is what you're feeling, by the way, as you try to bring out those bad thoughts like, this doesn't work. But for it to work, the rest of us must be convinced or forced to stop using our own experiences and stop thinking in academic and scientific absolutes to draw our own conclusion. Once that is established, it is easy to reject morality. And then, only a short step into accepting the idea that people of third world nations should live out their days in total poverty. And it's all just for the common good. And by the way, eventually, it should be good for all of us to live that way too. Learn to live on less is their mantra. It is then just a short journey to accepting euthanasia as a means to rid us of the elderly who are no longer useful for the village. And then it's even a shorter step to accepting the final solution of forced abortion for population control. Once Sager put this idea together, he began to contact world leaders to convince them of his plan. For success, he needed them to be the enforcement hammer. And you'll find on his website a series of letters from world leaders as they praise and endorse the plan. One is a letter from none other than Robert Mueller, the former Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations and affectionately known as the philosopher of the UN. Said Mueller in his letter, quote, I am referring to the need to establish a body of objective, globally acceptable information to serve as a foundation for global education. Now, the first step after that was to include K.B. Mather, the Director General of UNESCO, the man in charge of implementing global education policy in our public schools. And then there's Dale Ott of the World Council of Churches, and many more heads of the global and international organizations, those infamous NGOs, non-governmental organizations, that are responsible for writing policies and treaties that seep out of the UN into our national laws. And then there is this endorsement from Alexander King, the founder of the Club of Rome, one of the main NGO operations out of the UN that helped write Agenda 21 to begin with. He said, he wrote to Sager, quote, one aspect of your letter struck me forcibly. It was when you said, it is actually our thought process that is responsible for the predicament we find ourselves in. And concluded King, I couldn't agree with you more. Unless we find the means to change our thinking, I can see little hope in solving the supreme problem for humanity, its impending extinction. These powerful people are telling us that humans armed with knowledge and are dangerous to the new world order of peace and harmony which they intend to establish for us. No matter what you call it, this is thought control. Globally acceptable truth. It's the only way you will be permitted to think and you imagine the consequences such thought control will have on the human race. Thomas Edison wouldn't have been allowed to even think about such radical changes as alternatives to candle wax in our well-ordered society. The Wright brothers would have been hanged as heretics to suggest that man could fly. This is the process by which our children are being deliberately dumbed down in government schools. The premise of globally acceptable truth is the very root of today's public school education, the curriculum. And the process is working like a well-oiled machine. Our children are ready to give up their liberty in our way of life with barely a blink of an eye. And they're now begging for socialism. This is the reason. This is why I wanted to bring it out to you today. You're all puzzled by seeing what our children are doing coming out of the schools. They need to have their crayons and their safe spaces and everything because somebody said something else. This is the reason. Globally acceptable truth. It has been pounded on in their brains from the day they walked in kindergarten until the day they graduate, and then they get into college and they really can get it. This is what you have to understand. Misleading sound bites are replacing reasoned thought. Just say, "Go green," and the eyes of the masses glaze over and the people comply. Or, my favorite from the Clintons, "It's for the children." And we give up control to the state. Or, "It's just to keep you safe." And we openly encourage the creation of a total surveillance society. The process is so all-encompassing, so all-pervasive, that most people don't even recognize it as being employed. From its inception in 1992, the United Nations Earth Summit, with 50,000 delegates. Think of that. This wasn't a picnic in the park. 50,000 delegates made up of heads of state, diplomats, and non-governmental organizations hailed Agenda 21 as the comprehensive blueprint for the reorganization of human society. Has there ever been a more powerful statement made of the purpose and the aims of government control? A comprehensive blueprint for the reorganization of human society. The Agenda 21 document was quite detailed and explicit in its purpose and its goals. They warned us that the reorganization would be dictated through all-encompassing policies affecting every aspect of our lives, using environmental protection simply as the excuse to pull at our emotions and get us to voluntarily surrender our liberties. It doesn't matter how many rights you think you have if you don't have a planet to stand on. That's the line they use over and over again. Fear, fear, fear. Everything is based on that. Section 1 details social and economic dimensions of the plan of Agenda 21, including redistribution of wealth to eradicate poverty, maintain health through vaccinations and modern medicine, and population control. To introduce the plan, the Earth Summit chairman, Maurice Strong, you may know him, neighbor, he boldly proclaimed, quote, "Current lifestyles and consumption patterns of the affluent middle class involving meat intake, use of fossil fuels, appliances, and air conditioning and suburban housing are not sustainable. And of course, according to the plan, if it's not sustainable, it must be stopped." In support of the plan, David Brower of the Sierra Club, and Sierra Club was one of the authors of Agenda 21, said this: "Childbearing should be a punishable crime against society unless the parents hold a government license." Leading environmental groups advocated that the Earth could only support a maximum of 1 billion people, leading famed Dr. Jacques Cousteau to declare, "In order to stabilize world populations, we must eliminate 350,000 people per day." Section 2 of Agenda 21 provides the conservation and management of resources for development by outlining how environmental protection was to be the main weapon, including global protection of the atmosphere, the lands, the mountains, the oceans, the fresh water, all under the control of the United Nations. Now, why did they decide to use the excuse of environmental protection to enforce their agenda for control? Because the environment doesn't respect political boundaries. Rivers run through several districts and countries. Animal habitats and bioregions run through multiple regions. So this is a useful tool to break through the political boundaries of our nation, of our states, our regions, and that boundary also around your property. Your property. That's how they're using the environment to change our very system of government. The main weapon for the agenda was the threat of environmental Armageddon, particularly manifested through the charge of man-made global warming, now conveniently becomes climate change. So it'd be cold or hot, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter if true science refused to cooperate in this scheme, as actual global temperatures really are not rising, and their countries, there continues to be no evidence of any man-made effect on the climate. Truth has been important to destroy by these scaremongers. They don't want truth. No one stated that intent more clearly than Canada's former Ministry of the Environment, Christine Stewart, when she said, "No matter if the science of global warming is all phony, climate change provides the greatest opportunity to bring about justice and equality in the world." And to drive home their complete lack of concern for truth, Paul Watson of Greenpeace declared, "It doesn't matter what is true, it only matters what people believe is true." So, in their zealotry to enforce the grand agenda, social justice became the moral force over the rule of law, as free enterprise, private property, rural communities, and individual consumption habits became the targets labeled as racist and a social injustice. The UN Commission on Global Governance clearly outlined the goal for global control, stating, quote, "The concept of national sovereignty has been immutable, indeed a sacred principle of international relations. It is a principle which will yield only slowly and reluctantly to the new imperatives of global environmental cooperation." Finally, Agenda 21 was summed up in supporting documents this way, quote, "Effective execution of Agenda 21 will require a profound reorientation of all human activity. Unlike anything the world has ever experienced, it requires a major shift in the priorities of both governments and individuals and all unprecedented deployment of human and financial resources. This shift will demand that a concern for the environmental consequences of every human action be integrated into individual and collective decision-making at every level." Of course, such harsh terms had to be hidden from the average people. If the plan was to be successfully imposed, they called it a suggestion for voluntary action. This is what they use against me constantly. Tom DeWeese makes up all these conspiracy theories about Agenda 21, which was just a voluntary suggestion. If a country wanted to do something good for their country, well, they could do it. This is what they use constantly. Well, however, while using that innocent-sounding language, the Agenda 21 shock troops lost no time in pushing it into government policy. In the United States, it was the President's Council on Sustainable Development, put in by Bill Clinton, and on that council were many of the NGOs that wrote Agenda 21 in the first place, representatives of every government agency, and global corporations. They came together with a specific purpose of taking the suggestion from the United Nations and making it policy and law. And that's how they've done it. However, as we, the opponents, started to gain ground in exposing its true purpose and citizens began to storm city halls protesting local implementation, suddenly the once proud proponents lost their collective memories about Agenda 21. Never heard of it. And I love this one. There are no blue-helmeted troops at City Hall. Well, that's all they keep telling us. It's just local, local, local. And they'll say, and I have one of them say, "Oh, you mean that innocuous 20-year-old document that has no enforcement capability? Well, this isn't that. This is all local." These are the excuses that rain down on us from the planners, the NGOs, the government agents, as they scrambled to hide their true intentions. Meanwhile, of course, in the United States, the American Planning Association is the largest planning group playing games with all this. And you've got them here. They probably have different names. But the American Planning Association is in almost every single community. Well, I love messing with these guys because they're absolute cowards. And the minute you start to show some kind of resistance, they start to panic. And as we started to get lots more people standing up against all this, then they became very alarmed, and they created, on their website, the Agenda 21 Myths and Facts page. And this is supposed to counter all of our claims. Then the APA organized a boot camp to retrain its planners to deal with us using a glossary for the public, teaching them new ways to talk about planning. Here's the opening line from this glossary. Quote, "Given the heightened scrutiny of planners by some members of the public, what is said or not said is especially important in building support for planning." The glossary went on to list words not to use like public visioning, stakeholders, density, and smart growth, because such words made the critics see red. You know, when I believe in something, I stand up proud for it no matter what. I don't care who's attacking me for it or anything else. If I believe in it, I stand for it. So the minute somebody starts playing these kind of games, then I have to say, what are they really trying to hide? What's really going on here? And that's what it's about. Local elected officials, backed by NGO groups and planners, began to deride local activists, sometimes denying them access to public meetings. I know you've all felt this. Telling them that Agenda 21 conspiracy theory has been debunked. And I keep saying, by who? I was testifying before a committee in the state of Maine, in the state legislature. And before that, I met with a reporter. And I took a document, and I put it in his hands, and I said, "Here, hold this." And he said, "Why?" I said, "That is a report from the United States, it's 70 pages long, from 1997, from the United States to the United Nations to report on the progress of implementing Agenda 21. And I said, "I put it in your hands because they will tell you it doesn't exist. It's in your hands." So, you know, and I had a city councilman say, "This is what's trending." Oh, okay. If everybody's doing it, then it must be okay. Yeah. Imagine how the people in the gulags felt. Over the years, since the introduction of Agenda 21 in 1992, the United Nations has created several companion updates to the original documents. This practice serves two purposes. One is to provide more detail on how the plan is to be implemented. The second is to excite its global activists with a new rallying cry. In 2000, the UN held the Millennium Summit, launching the Millennium Project, featuring 8 goals for global sustainability to be reached by 2015. Then, when those goals were not reached, the UN held another summit in New York City in September of 2015, this time outlining 17 goals to be reached by 2030. This document became known as the 2030 Agenda. I have lots of people, I keep talking about Agenda 21, and people say, "Oh, no, that's not anymore. Now it's the 2030 Agenda." And it's all the same agenda. It's just, they're progressing here. It's all the same. They're just getting more detailed. So, now, 2019, enter the Green New Deal. Representing the boldest tactic yet. It's not just for the United States. It's the real global plan that has been hiding there all along. Finally, in this plan, the forces behind the agenda have boldly thrown off their cloaking devices and their innocent-sounding arguments that they just want to protect the environment and make a better life for us all. Instead, they are now openly revealing that their goal is socialism and global control, just as I've been warning for all these past 27 years, and now they are determined to take direct action to finally make it law. Take a good look. Those of you who've heard my warnings about Agenda 21 over the years, do you see the plan that I've warned you about being fully in place with this Green New Deal? I warned that Agenda 21 would control every aspect of our lives, including how and where we live, the jobs we have, the mode of transportation that's available to us, and what we can eat. The Green New Deal is a tax on everything we do, make, wear, eat, drive, drink, import, export, and even breathe. In opposing smart growth plans in your local community, I said the main goal was to eliminate cars, to be replaced with bikes, walking, and light rail trains. The Green New Deal calls for the elimination of the internal combustion engine. and stay alert. The next step will be to put a limit on the number of new vehicles to be sold. We'll start to see that limited. Based on, we'll see bans on commercial truck shipping will follow. Then there will be, they'll turn to airplanes, reducing their use. We've already heard about this. Always, higher and higher taxes will be used to get the public to voluntarily reduce their use of such personal transportation choices. You see, that's how it works. Slowly but steadily towards the goal. They never stop. And you cannot stand there and talk to them in a reasoned way and have them say, oh golly, I didn't know that. Oh, okay, we'll change everything. Because reason has nothing to do with it. It is about control, about power. And you're not, as George Carlin once said, you're not in their club. I warned that under sustainable or smart growth programs, now taking over every city, that single-family homes are a target for elimination, to be replaced by high-rise stack and pack apartments in the name of reducing energy use. That will lead to curfews on energy use, mandating the power be turned off during certain hours. Heating oil devices will become illegal. Gradually, energy use of any kind will be continually reduced. Take a look at California. It's exactly what they're doing. You know, it used to be I'd say these things, people say, oh, that's crazy, that's going to happen. Now I've got all the examples in the world. The Green New Deal calls for government control of every single home, office, and factory, and they're advocating that all of these homes be torn down, all these buildings torn down or retrofitted so that they comply with the massive environmental energy regulations. I warned that Agenda 21, sustainable policy, sought to drive those in rural areas off the farms and into the cities where they could be better controlled. You see, people who live in the rural areas, they can live on their own. They don't need Safeway. They can get their own power and everything else. That is a grave danger to those implementing these policies. Most recently, I warned that the beef industry is in a direct target for elimination. It will start with mandatory decreases in meat consumption until it disappears from our daily diet. The consumption of dairy will follow. Controlling what we eat is a major part of the Green New Deal. And I warned that part of the plan for Agenda 2030 was zero economic growth. The Green New Deal calls for a massive welfare plan where no one earns more than anyone else. Incentive to get ahead is dead. New inventions would disrupt their plans for a well-organized, controlled society. So, in the future, where will the jobs come from after we've banned most manufacturing, shutting down most stores, stopped single-family home construction, closed the airline industry, and severely regulated farms and the entire food industry? This is their answer to the hated free markets of individual choice. So there you have it. Agenda 21, the Millennium Project, Agenda 2030, the Green New Deal. That's progress in the world of progressives. They warned us from the very beginning that their plan was the comprehensive blueprint for the reorganization of human society. And so it is, to be the total destruction of our way of life. The Green New Deal will destroy the very concept of freedom, eliminating private property, locally elected representatives of government, free markets, and individual freedom. All decisions in our lives will be made for us by the government just to protect the environment, of course. And now, it has become the center of nearly every political debate. I was very disturbed when I saw that the U.S. Senate, Mitch McConnell, I've already expressed to a few people here what I think of Mitch McConnell, but he quickly had this vote, 57-0 on the Green New Deal. And they laughed. Oh, golly. They won't even support their own bill. Take a look at what's happened since then. The fools are the Republicans who laughed. In New York City and in California, they are implementing their own pieces of the Green New Deal. Everywhere you hear them talking now, they're bringing up the Green New Deal. It's becoming part of the national debate. I have a copy of the French Green New Deal that's even more radical and revealing than the U.S. version. See, they didn't put in all the nicey nice words and pretend like this isn't what it really is. Let me just share a couple of things with you in here. It's coming. Mandatory fixed working hours in order to simplify the implementation of public transportation and carpooling. We won't have 3 shifts a day. We'll just have 1. That'll save energy. For short trips, less than 3 miles, the standard should be soft transportation. In other words, use your bicycle. New single-family home construction, except for trailers, prohibited. New buildings must be exclusively condos with a maximum per capita living area of 320 square feet. The space used per person must be reduced by 20% by 2030 from the current 430 square feet per person to, well, I said 320. So, and what are we seeing in California, in Minnesota, in the state of Oregon? They are banning zoning for single-family homes because that's racist. Those people are self-segregating themselves from people they don't want to live next to. You think I'm kidding? And they declared a housing crisis. Well, when you use smart growth and you put a line around the city and say no growth will take place outside of that, what happens? You have to go up because there's no room to go out. Portland, Oregon is the poster child for this. They, in that period of time, the last 20 years as they implemented this, their population grew by 80%. But the urban growth boundary around it has barely expanded. And now they have a housing crisis. We don't have room for you to have a single-family home there with a backyard and a garage and all that. We could put 100 families in an apartment building there. You racist. How nasty of you. This is what they're doing. So, and now, this has all become the center of all, as I said, these political debates. So we see how quickly we've begun to accept these ideas that we would not normally support. That's the power of globally acceptable truth. It's all around us. Global warming is globally acceptable truth. The United Nations Declaration on Human Rights is globally acceptable truth. Universal health care is globally acceptable truth. Mandatory purchase of a Prius is globally acceptable truth. The common good over the individual is globally acceptable truth. Independent sovereign nations as a source of war is globally acceptable truth. Global governance for the future peace of mankind is globally acceptable truth. Global citizenship is globally acceptable truth. Severe restrictions on the population is globally acceptable truth. Sager's Eden Project is the key to understanding what has been done to our society and how it is being implemented right before our very eyes. We must learn that we are not facing a scattering of issues that are just wrong-headed, just spring up once in a while. Instead, it's being orchestrated with a specific mindset behind it. Step by step, we have been surrounded and we surrendered the ability to reason and to take responsibility for our own lives, and instead are giving up our lives to government to be cradled in its warm and safe cocoon from birth to death. There is an endless supply of examples to show how the process is destroying our once free society. In fact, what was once a slow process, perhaps moving at a slow rate that most people didn't even notice, has become a tsunami. The public school system is a major example. There are now more psychologists on the payroll of public schools than teachers. The result is an abuse of innocent minds beyond a description. Today, dumbed-down children emerge from classrooms like zombies, modern children of the corn, unable to question authority, unable to think for themselves, the perfect citizens of the global village, or, pardon me, but the global village idiots. The imposition of environmental regulations have become the greatest threat to our ownership and control of private property. The U.S. Supreme Court has now declared that no private property they say there is no private property and that any community is free to take any property it desires for other private development, all for the common good of the community. We have accepted the rise of hordes of powerful non-governmental agencies like planning commissions, transportation commissions, homeowner associations, neighborhood development councils, historic preservation councils, and stakeholder councils. And we call them now the proper tools of government. Yet, the more non-elected councils making the rules, the less power from the elected representatives chosen by the people. They have less say in how they affect our lives. And I think this is something you might want to take note of as you're talking to some of these elected officials, and make note that they, by their own actions, are losing their own power and why they were elected. The true purpose of their new government structure is to create and enforce the global village. The policy of choice to make it happen, of course, is sustainable development. Sustainable development has three components: global land use, global education, global population control. Sustainable development is anti-free enterprise, anti-limited government, and anti-liberty. But most communities and government entities have accepted it as I said before, the proper role of government. A free society protects its property owners and businesses and helps them to go further about in their lives unencumbered. A free society doesn't set up spy mechanisms to track the whereabouts of the people through ID cards and biometric databases. A free society doesn't close down whole industries and towns at the whim of special interest groups using made-up excuses like, oh, we got to protect the spotted owl, or what was that other thing we were talking about today, yesterday? You know, lizards, whatever. Yeah. There you go. Yeah. A free society defends its borders and protects its citizens from outside invasion. But all of these things are being done through the process of sustainable development, and there is no politician, no political party, no elected official even mentioning it. Like a bad plastic surgery, our society is being transformed into a hideous monster, and it will destroy everything you hold dear in life. In the name of sustainable development, there are now movements to ban the over-the-counter natural supplements and fast food and air conditioning and the consumption of meat and cars, suburban housing, the family pets, plastic, fireplaces, and even he and she pronouns. And isn't it interesting? That was all outlined by Maurice Strong in 1992 when he introduced Agenda 21. Ban it, ban it, ban it, ban it. These are the sounds of the bombs going off in a war for control. The war against freedom. The one statement that should never be uttered in a free society is ban it. A free society can't exist under this weight. Sustainable development is the policy Mr. Sager's thought control was created to implement. And to Mr. Sager, these concepts we call freedom are nothing more than delusion. And that's why he and his fellow travelers are so dangerous to us. They use every sort of deception, half-truth, and non-science to implement this concept for the virtual captivity of the human spirit. Through the policies of sustainable development and globally acceptable truth, we are very quickly being led back to the tyranny and to the dark ages, the darkest ages of human history. The last time the human race was faced with such an attack on reason and thought was during the Inquisition of the 13th century. Then, most of Europe lived under the tyranny of one small self-appointed gang, which made the decisions about the proper thought and conduct and what it was to be. Anyone who disagreed was charged with heresy and called a lunatic. Most were automatically found guilty and were either ruined, tortured, or killed. Are we not seeing this happen now? Yeah. What we're seeing happening in the halls of government? People lived then in terror. And I believe Antifa, or the brown shirts that match Hitler's brown shirts, and their role is to make us afraid to assemble and to speak out. That's their job in this whole thing. And we're seeing it happen. Learn this. Sustainable development is completely based on fear. Its every policy is based on dealing with an emergency that doesn't actually exist. That's the tactic. That's why there is this violent reaction, the screaming, the crying to our opposition. It's the reason why you face such resistance when you try to oppose these programs coming from your local government. We have one choice. One choice. If you want to restore our freedom, fight. Fight for your homes. Fight for your community. And I want to tell you, it will take trench warfare in every local municipality and every regional and district council in their meetings. You have to be there every time. Do not stop. To fight back, you have to take control of the debate. Make your local officials answer to you. Make property rights protection the center of your fight. And the reason I say that, the reason I wrote my book, Sustainable, and everything's based on private property, because, there's all kinds of issues involved here. But as I said in the beginning, people can't wrap their head around all that. They start down this path, and they get diverted over here, and pretty soon they quit because they can't focus. Here's the secret they don't want you to know. Sustainable development has a bit of kryptonite in it. That kryptonite is they cannot implement sustainable development policy without destroying private property. If you focus on private property and keep pushing and begin to push back on those policies, then we can begin to restore freedom and other things, push back on other policies. So, here are some guidelines, and you'll be happy to know that I brought a few pages with me. Not enough for everybody, but for some who are really interested in this, what I'm going to tell you, I have it written down. I can give it to you. But here's some examples to follow to build opposition. 1, and you've already done this, build a core working group in your own communities, 5 to 10. That's all you need. 2, research all the players, the contracts, the plans, the vendors, the NGOs, and so forth. How many people really enjoyed researching? I always say you guys are the most important people in the room because everybody else wants to go to the fun stuff. That's the hard work. But you find the details, and then the others have the weapons they need to fight. And you can find in there, looking into, researching these things, these players, the contracts, and so forth, then you can find who's really targeted. Once you find an area, maybe it's an area of town that's targeted by a plan, go there. Go to those people and say, do you know what's about to happen here? Build your movement by making them your allies. And the worst thing for these guys and these councils is to have the very victims that they're about to attack coming in and talking to them. Immediately start to attend all the meetings. Take notes and videos, if you can, every single time. And from what you learn from attending these meetings and doing the research, build a strategy and create talking points, create handouts to let people know what it is you're really opposing. Why? As you go to the public with your fight, challenge the plans by exposing these facts. How will the plan harm the local economy? Expose the public-private partnerships that are a full risk to the city. When you've got NGOs and the planners and developers, so forth, all working with government, that's a public-private partnership. And that is not free enterprise. It is not limited government. That is right out of Mussolini's fascist playbook. How it will increase the cost and even destroy property ownership. How it will change the culture and the atmosphere of your town. How it will adversely affect any zoning that you have. If they're putting out bids for them, one of the things they like to do is have a no-bid situation or a no competition for bids. Demand that they have at least 3 bids. Let's see what this is really about and who the players are. Expose any financial conflicts of interest, those developers, those public-private partnerships, the NGOs. And this one's important. And I think when I heard this morning what you're talking about, you're already doing some of this. Methodically and consistently visit local officials to discuss these plans. Make yourself known to them. The biggest problem of our movement is those NGOs are there constantly. That is all your elected officials hear. Everywhere they go, they begin to think, this is a proper rule of government. And one of you show up and you start saying, no, that's not true. And they're going, Then if you're there all in front of them, make them worried that if we do this, I'm going to hear from Mary again. Bill's going to be in here. Oh, geez, I'll tell you what victory looks like. Victory is when the NGO comes with the next plan, says, hey, got it right here for you, got the money, got it all right here in a box, ready to go. And your counselor starts to get the sweat running down through here going, do you know what they'll do to me if we do this? That's victory. That's because you were there on the battlefield. Organize an impromptu town hall meeting for citizens and tell them what's going on. Number one goal, reveal the hidden power of the NGOs. They've all got a history. Begin to put that out. Number two goal, when you're going to talk about property rights, everybody talks property rights. What do you mean by that? Get a clear definition of property rights and so that you have a platform to stand on, and I'm going to give it to you. This was written by a Supreme Court justice in the state of Washington named Richard B. Sanders. He wrote this because in 1997, up until that, they were getting all these sustainable development property rights challenges in front of them, and they didn't have a good definition. So he wrote it, and this is it. Property in a thing consists not merely in its ownership and possession, but in the unrestricted right of use, enjoyment, and disposal. Anything which destroys any of the elements of property to that extent destroys the property itself. The substantial value of property lies in its use. If the right of use be denied, the value of the property is annihilated and ownership is rendered a barren right. Now,
Tom, can you read that through again just so that everyone absorbs it?
Well, property in its use. The use of property, that's the detail. Property and its use. If they take away the use, if all you have is the right to pay the taxes and pay the mortgage on it, that is a barren right. You're just a tenant, and a tenant can be removed. And we've got to start treating property owners like owners. And I'll tell you what, use the word unrestricted and watch their heads explode. I guarantee, tell me if I'm right if you try this. You put this in front of them, here will be the response. If people have the right to use their property that way, somebody's going to put a smelly old pig farm next door to you. Every single time. That is the excuse that they have used. It must be the most horrendous thing they can think of. I always thought maybe we would allow liberals to move in the neighborhood, and I can't think of anything worse than that. Private property ownership and its unrestricted use is the foundation for a nationwide revolution of freedom. Demand it. Get tough and do not retreat. Above all, to fight back today, you and I need to know that the tyranny of sustainable development is not inevitable, and it can and it will be stopped if we fight. Stop. Don't ever look down in defeat. I know it's overwhelming. Believe me, I know. Stop believing that the other side is too powerful. Understand that they are terrified of the possibility that you will learn that they have power only so long as you believe they do. Their worst enemy is a bright spotlight on their corruption. It's time that we demand a government that treats property owners like owners, not chattel to be pushed around as they like. And how do you fight back? One thing is very clear. They will not be able, as I said before, to enforce sustainable development without diminishing property rights. You stand up for property rights and you will stop sustainable development and put the cork back in the government bottle. But you must understand, your fight must start on the local level. These forces pushing sustainable development are deeply entrenched in every city. They are highly organized and massively funded, and they have a very specific goal, and they intend to see it fulfilled. Today, you and I face the most dangerous challenges to freedom, perhaps in world history. The authors of these so-called local visioning plans focus on their plans for your future. You need to do that too. What kind of future will this plan leave for your children? What kind of nation will we leave them? The choices we make today, the battles we choose to fight here and now will determine if your children even understand the concepts of freedom, free enterprise, individuality, private property rights. The battle starts in your home, in your neighborhood, and in your community. The plan can and it must be stopped. You see, as I said, I believe if we preserve private property rights and individual expression and free enterprise in your own community at the local level, then we can preserve freedom as a nation. Let me just finish with this. To fully understand the consequences to our society that we are witnessing under globally acceptable truth and all of this, I suggest you read a tiny little book written decades ago by Ayn Rand entitled Anthem. This book describes a society that emerged from a great war, a society built on top of the old order, now forgotten and forbidden, called the unmentionable times. You see that happening? The people now exist only to serve the state. They are conceived in the controlled palaces of mating. They die in the home of the useless. From cradle to grave, the crowd is one, a great we, led and controlled by the elders. There are no names, no individuality, no identity. Sound familiar? Only numbers. And in today's school-to-work programs and jobs are assigned to them, well, as in today's smart growth policy, there's a wall around the city, and beyond which no one's allowed to travel. It's called the uncharted forest. But the elders hadn't counted on one who didn't go along, one who insisted on the ability to think for himself. His name is Equality 72521. He's a street sweeper, and he longs to be in the Council of Scholars, to work with science and knowledge. Well, one day, while sweeping the streets, Equality 72521 discovers a hole, and inside he finds a tunnel. And that tunnel was left from the unmentionable times. He discovers an odd, unknown device in there, an electric light. He takes it to the Council of Scholars, certain that they will be thrilled with this discovery that will make their lives better. Surely, now they will let him stay with them. Not only is he rejected, he is threatened with death for trying to question the wisdom of the elders and disrupting the harmony of the village. He runs into the uncharted forest, there to find a house from the unmentionable times, and in it, a library. There he finds words he has never heard before, the words that he needs to understand who he is, the word I, the word ego, the word individual. All words the elders try to destroy because they are the words that threaten their power over the masses. Those words give the people their own power, the power to think for themselves. This is the power you must never surrender. The social, economic, and political transformations sustainable development requires will mean the suppression of the human spirit. This is the enemy that we face. Every other issue is just a symptom. Understand that fact alone and become a very dangerous enemy of their schemes. Those armed with Donald Sager's blueprint of globally acceptable truth now haunt the upper levels of the UN, the national government, and our local council chambers. They have achieved many of their goals, but they have not yet won. And their arrogance and their impatience is resulting in a stirring of people around the world. Take a look at Hong Kong. They have experienced it all firsthand. The globalist whole agenda is built on a house of cards that stands only when you are ignorant and compliant. Now is the time. Now is the time to write, speak, protest, demonstrate, demand, refuse. And take heart from what Gandhi told us. First they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, and then we win. It matters how you stand. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions if you have any. Yeah.
I completely agree with your overall thrust. You're absolutely right about exploring all the extent to which our institutions have been taken over. I think the fight is massive. I think it's extremely difficult to contemplate how we win. I will take exception, though, with one of your statements, one of your rallying calls. And that relates to the quote of the Washington judge about unrestricted use. Unrestricted use is not, in fact, part of our conservative heritage. What we have in our patents in our land is a guarantee to the quiet possession of the said lands and tenements for your sole and only use forever. If we have quiet possession of our lands and tenements, our neighbors do too. And that means part of our heritage of government and law and freedom is that you do not have the right to deny the freedom and the rights of your neighbor. And when we come to increasing controls, some of those controls are necessary to protect the rights of your neighbor. And so unrestricted use does not mean the right to do something which harms your neighbor's rights.
Absolutely correct. Absolutely correct.
And so I think that the term unrestricted use has to be used with great care, because the moment we use that term unrestricted use, we provide ammunition to those on the other side that says you are willing to deny the rights of others. So we have to qualify how we define our property rights. The right to the quiet possession, the unmolested, the not abused possession that belongs to all of us. So I would just urge real caution in the way in which we describe it, because precisely that term is the term that is argued by the most oppressive developers.
Oh, you're absolutely right.
And so we have to not fall into their trap. We have to preserve
I agree.
our
I agree with you.
fundamental
Let me explain this to you. Since the beginning of human settlements, we have always had nuisance laws. If your neighbor is doing something that is damaging your use of your property, then you have recourse. First of all, as a neighbor to a neighbor, guy next door has a light on at night. He has bright, loud sounds, whatever the case may be, that is affecting your ability to use your property as you choose. First of all, as a neighbor, you can walk over to him and say, Charlie, can you turn the light on off at night? It's shining in my bedroom window. Charlie's a good guy. He goes, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize. He turns it off, neighbor to neighbor, done. We didn't need government in that. If Charlie's a jerk, then we have nuisance laws and we can take him to court and we can deal with it that way. The situation we deal with in sustainable development is they are putting together one size fits all for everybody. And these are done by people who have absolutely no stake in your property whatsoever, and they're going to tell you exactly what you're going to do with it. And that's the violation to you. So this situation, what we're talking about here, I agree maybe we should add some of those words that you mentioned, but the point is that we're talking about what has built society since the beginning of time, what built our countries, that neighbors, living with neighbors, dealing with neighbors. Today, we aren't allowed to deal with our neighbors. We have government to deal with, and this is what we're opposed to, and this is what we're after. I agree with you about that, and maybe we should add those words, but that is what's behind it, is that we have neighbor to neighbor instead of government to government. So, yeah.
Charles, isn't that what common law is all about?
It is, and we've lost common law. The whole notion that it's Napoleonic code is absurd. Canada became British territory after the 7 Years' War between France and England. That happened in 1759, Wolfe defeated Montcalm, 1763, the Treaty of Paris. 1769, Napoleon was born. So it's hard to imagine how we could have inherited Napoleonic code 6 years before Napoleon's birth. But it's a kind of myth that's spread through our country that really destroys those roots of common law, which are covered very well in Blackstone's commentaries. They're essential. But Blackstone's commentaries is not even known to lawyers today, let alone to lawmakers.
I think this is what we're really about. That's why we're here, is to get that back and to restore those rights. And we can't just accept what they give us as the playing field.
Yeah.
And so, I think that goes along with it. Yeah.
It's not so much what they give us, Tom, it's what they tell us we have to do. Like, Canada's statutes are admiralty, maritime, military, merchant law, contract law with a little bit of civil law from Quebec mixed in, okay? And as he said, common law disappeared in the 70s. Basically, the only time you get a look at common law is if you're criminally charged with doing harm to another person, damage to property, or becoming a threat to society, then you may get the opportunity to have a jury of your peers hear your case. Otherwise, a judge decides.
And that is changing. They're focusing on taking that away as well. But again, you look at, okay, you said you had it till the 70s. What changed? What happened? And we begin to push back there too. I mean, I'm just saying that's what we have to look at. What do we do to get it back and reestablish the government that we grew up with?
What you do to get it back is you establish your own relationship with government.
Yeah, I agree with that.
How do you do that?
You learn,
Get a crowd behind you.
you learn what your status is in relation to a statute. You learn what your standing is in relation to the court, and you separate from their jurisdiction. And to do that, you need to learn how to do a simple affidavit.
Anything else? Well, let me give you a little self-promotion. Sorry. I do have materials back on the table back there, and I've written 3 books. The first one, I've only got one left of, is my first book was called Now Tell Me I Was Wrong. And this was a group of articles I wrote on a bunch of issues, education and personal privacy and environmental and all that. And it's a good history book, and I've updated it, and it's still very, very relevant. I, a couple of years ago, found myself writing something I never thought I would write before, or would ever do. I wrote a political thriller murder mystery. And it's all based on the sustainable world. It's called Erase. And I was absolutely astounded as I wrote this. Every issue I talk about in there actually exists, and a lot of the dialogue or things actually said by other people. I just put it in other people's mouths. But when I got my first reviews, I fell on the floor, having never written fiction before in my life. The first review I got said, "Tom, I think this is the most important political novel since 1984, Atlas Shrugged, and Michael Crichton's State of Fear." And I've gotten 6 other reviews comparing it to those books. So it's, and I just reread it recently, and I'm amazed. I wrote it before Trump, and how much I got, kind of the whole flavor is in there. So you see it. And then, of course, my newest book, Sustainable, The War on Free Enterprise, Private Property, and Individuals. And I wrote this as a handbook for you, to have the background of all these things we've talked about, to have the players, who they are, how they operate, and try to address some things to do with it. And I've gotten very good response to that as well. A lot of people are buying it and giving it to their local elected officials and stuff. So, so I've got those all back there, and even got a DVD of giving a presentation on Agenda 21 stuff. So I don't want to take them home. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Tom,
Yeah.
what can you do when
And you know that across Canada, almost all of the mayors of each city belongs to United Nations Compact of Mayor. That's really hard to deal with when their orders come from somewhere else.
Well, they're all, we have, in the US, we have the National Conference of Mayors, and that's the same thing. They're all tied to the whole thing. They've made sustainable development part of their whole thing. The only thing I know to do is, you've got to make them feel pain over what they're doing. And of course, you've got to get involved in the elective process. And these are all things, somebody wants to hear this. They want to have a silver bullet, boom, here it is. And it doesn't exist. You have to organize. You have to be involved. And, why are they so powerful? And because these forces, these NGO groups and everything are there, and they're pushing it, and they've surrounded them, they're putting money in their pockets, they're giving them political power, and we aren't there for the most part. Now, you guys are exceptional because you're activists, but the average people out there aren't doing that. And so they're able to just walk over them. So you, as a few, come in and they just stomp all over you. As I was trying to outline there, if you have your facts of what's going on and how it's going to affect people, and you begin to prepare papers on that, and so forth, and when you go down, and you get there, do they give you guys now, when you go to your council meetings and stuff, do they give you 3 minutes as they look down at you on high? I love that, yeah. Golly, I'm able to address the government for 3 minutes, if they permit me. And, well, don't be the only one. Don't ever try to do any of this by yourself. That's number one. Have this cadre of people ready. And I have another some of these things I've prepared for U.S., but I think you can maybe rework them to work for your situation. I've got a proclamation for the defense of citizens' property rights, and all it says is, if in their meetings they're going to do something that discusses something that's going to involve my property, they'll bring me into the discussion. Boy, there's a radical idea. It says if they go ahead with it and do what they're going to do, then they're going to compensate me. And they're not going to come on my property with all their cameras and their measuring sticks and everything else without my permission. It means I own the property, it's mine. And what the idea of this is that instead of rushing in to get those 3 minutes and you ask, you start talking about this is Agenda 21, and then you get the sigh, the eye roll, one of those guys, and the NGOs back there going, guys, nuts, don't pay attention to them. So instead, you just walk up to the podium and you say, ladies, gentlemen, as you're bringing these plans, these planners into our community, I've just got one question for you. What guarantees do I have that you'll protect my property rights? Now, what we get there, we get people saying, councilmen and so forth saying, well, I'm a property owner too, of course I will. And you just smile at them and say, I'm really happy to hear you say that, but I'd like to have it in writing, please. And you put this in front of them. Now, we haven't had a single city council sign this. I never expected them to. We had a county commission down in Roanoke, Virginia. This is where we did I had a lady was kind of my guinea pig on this, and the head of the council refused. She said, well, what are you going to sign it? She said, well, I refuse. We're not going to do that. Well, why? Well, I'm not going to debate it with you. I don't want to debate. I just want to know why you won't sign it. And he said, I think there's a bigger agenda afoot here. Yeah, there is. And here's the agenda. When they refuse to sign it, they have proven who they are and what they're going to do. Now you have the means to begin to run campaigns against them. Not just an election campaign, but what about showing up with 25 people with posters and so forth and papers to hand out the next meeting and say, why won't Councilor so-and-so defend my property rights? And begin to, I was in Colorado, and some people there were showing me a chart. In this little town in Durango, Colorado, oil was a big part of their income there. And the city councilwoman, I don't know all the details to it, but somehow she got something through that damaged the oil industry's abilities to work there. And they're leaving, pulling out. And they showed me this chart, this it was showing how the income of the community was going down as a result of this. And I looked at that chart and I said, put her picture on it, it's hers. You know, make them accountable for what they do. Now we're working on something, and I don't know that this will work here. We were talking last night, and maybe you can figure out a way to make this work with some different legislation. But everywhere I go, whenever I'm in a meeting with people, we're trying to organize ideas and stuff, I always bring up the fact, what I hate the most is the arrogance of these guys. That they have that smirk on their face. They don't care anything about what you have to say. And it's because they have no consequences for their actions. And they, you know, even if you were able to sue the city over the policy, well, the city pays the tax, or the taxpayers pay the tax, pay the fines, and so forth. And these guys have no repercussions for what they've done. And I'm always bringing this up. If we could just get legislation passed through a legislature that says that we, could make them responsible. Well, now trying to get people to vote on a bill that will make them personally responsible for something, right? Sure, we're going to do that. Well, I brought it up back in April. I brought it up in yet another meeting, and a guy sitting there looked at me and said, "Oh, you mean Section 1983?" I said, "What?" He said, "In the U.S. Civil Rights Act of 1964, there is a Section 1983 that says if somebody violates your civil rights, it could be an individual, it could be a government agent, it could be an elected official, and you can sue them and prove that they have done this. And there's about a 6-step process of how you have to do that. You can prove it, and you win. That person can't hide behind government. They are individually responsible for what happens, and they pay their own fines and they pay their own legal fees." And so, you know, I did a flip-flop over that, and I running home. I'm working with an attorney out in Idaho. His name is Fred Kelly Grant. He's brilliant on these things. And I said, "Fred, have you heard of Section 1983? And he said, "Yeah, I've used it." And I said, "For our kinds of issues?" And he said, "Yeah, and I've won." Since then, we've been working. Unfortunately, Fred is in very bad health, and we keep losing him once in a while, and then we have to come back. But we are almost there. We're going to put together a manual on how to file a Section 1983 suit, have the documents in it need to be filed, and the language you have to use step by step. I want to get this into the hands of every activist I can get it to. And I believe we won't have to file very many suits. I believe that once we win a few, that all we have to do is put one in front of them and say, "You're next." And I got other words for them too, but "You're next." And that we can. I think this is the first thing I've heard that we really have the means to fight back. Now, if you guys can figure out something that matches that, then do you have something?
We have Section 122 that deals with that.
Yeah.
And what you do is you bring a private prosecution, and a number of people have been doing that.
Okay.
That's exactly what it does, right to the letter. It holds them responsible, whether or not they would be responsible if they were an individual not working for the government. And Section 122.
There you go. Section 122.
You don't sue them over a criminal code offense.
Section 122 of what?
Of the criminal code of Canada.
Criminal code.
Yeah, it's a criminal offense for an official to do that. So you don't sue them in a civil lawsuit. You would bring a private prosecution.
One of the things, too, we're going to do is we're not going to file a suit against just one. Like, there's always one guy who's kind of the head of everything. We're going to file a suit against each individual of the council. Then we create a circular firing squad. They start firing at each other, you know? So, yeah. So, anyway, I'm out of time, aren't I? No? Okay. Yeah.
If you could divide the United States up into sections, and you've traveled around the United States, how would you define or segregate which ones have a higher property rights belief and some that don't have as much of a private property rights?
Well, the West obviously is the strongest for property rights. People living in rural areas and so forth, they live on the land, they live off the land, and they understand the value of the land. And it's very interesting to me because all of their plans call for getting people off the rural areas and get into the cities. And what do we see in the cities? We see the teeming poverty. We see total government control, total surveillance, everything. Obviously, that's where they want to get us to. And, you know, that's, so you get more and more people in the cities who, that's why, just like you guys, there's certain areas where the election comes in and the rural areas all go this way, and then the cities blast in, you know, the other way, and that's, we lose.
So we had Toronto
Yeah.
in Ontario, New York City, New York, and upstate
Yeah.
New York State being more rural.
Yeah, upstate New York's very, very conservative. Yeah.
Okay, so it's not any different down there?
No, nothing is different. It's all the same. So, yeah.
Most of us became activists because we had an individual history of some spat with the government somewhere. Curious to know your story. How did you get involved in this, and how did you become an activist and a speaker in this? Did you have something personal or somebody else in your life?
I graduated from high school. In high school, I was a terrible student. I never took a book home, and when we had a surprise quiz, it was really a surprise. And I just didn't care. I got into the 12th grade, and I had a teacher named Jerry Jones who taught government. And he was a former Marine. Funny thing was that he actually was very liberal, too. But he was he always had a gavel in his hand, and as a discussion would go about, he'd get people talking about, yeah, and he'd wave that gavel around. He'd get really excited. He stood in the wastebasket and waved the gavel around. Jerry Jones got my attention. And the next year, after I graduated, I got a job, my first job, and now the voting age in the country then was 21, and I got my first paycheck, and I said, they took taxes out of my check. That's taxation without representation. I can't vote. The war was on. I started an organization called Youth for Fair Government. The first speech I ever gave in my life was to testify before an Ohio Senate committee for a bill that I was partially responsible for being there, to lower the voting age. And that's how I got started. And then after that, along came a movement called Youth for Decency. Some of you might remember in Miami in 1969 that Jim Morrison of the Doors exposed himself to the crowd, and this Youth for Decency movement was born. And I became the Ohio coordinator for Youth for Decency. Youth for Decency morphed into a national organization called Young Americans for Freedom. And here is where I began to learn economics and philosophy, things like that. That was my education. And then we got into the campus wars. I became the state chairman of Young Americans for Freedom. And I was relating to somebody last night. There was a day when the ROTC was going to have their graduation exercises on campus. We got word that the SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, that were causing all the riots across country, were bringing in Bernardine Doran to stop the ROTC exercises. So we put a coalition together with the Young Republicans, and we literally stood in front of the ROTC building. Inside were 50 cops in riot gear, and we stood there blocking the way, and the graduation exercise is going on, and over the hill comes Bernardine Doran and the SDS with Viet Cong flags flying and so forth, and we had hand-to-hand combat. And and no riot cop was ever engaged. We stopped them, and the exercise went on. And so that's kind of how I got started. And one thing's led to another, and I got into the late 80s, and I started seeing all these environmental issues, and I kept thinking, what about the property rights? What about the property rights? And then I started learning, and a gentleman named Henry Lamb was my mentor. He went to all these UN meetings, and he learned all about Agenda 21. He brought about 50 of us together in a meeting and taught us everything about it, and there were 4 or 5 of us that took it on, and still doing it. So, yeah. Yeah.
Do you have any ideas on how we can do something with the public school system and our universities that are scaring our children to death, so that they're on anxiety pills or they're ADD or whatever?
Yeah.
Do you have any?
They are creating, as I said, the perfect global village idiots. That's the purpose of it. And, you know, it's the only thing I know to do, and I've had members of school boards tell me that all the things I talk about that's happening in the government buildings is exactly the same thing that's going on in schools, the same thing. But I hate to say this, but I think the only way is to get your kids out of the public schools. And I never, even though I lived off of Ohio State campus and I was, Young Americans for Freedom, doing what I was doing there, I never went there. I took a class in journalism and a class in accounting, and I was off and running. And after that, I never went there. I learned what I learned on my own, and totally self-taught with it. And so this whole thing that you've got to send your kid to college, you've got to send your kid to college, that's not true. And we've taken out of the schools the other kind of classes where kids would learn trades and things like that. We need to reestablish that and have people stand on their own. I know that's something nobody wants to hear, and you think, well, I can't do that. Yeah, you can. And I'm hearing that homeschooling is now exploding across the U.S. because of what's happening. But, yeah.
What websites could you recommend that we can learn how to be like this man that was sitting here talking about the court? Be that man or woman in the court and claim your rights back through affidavit.
I'll tell you, we have been meeting, and a lot of us were starting to put together some networking and stuff, and we have come to the absolute knowledge that the greatest weakness we have in our movement is the legal side of it. We don't have enough. I have people call me every day. I've got this problem, I've got that problem. I can't help them. I'm not an attorney. And there are legal foundations and things like that, but they are inundated. They are overrun. They have to really focus on what they're doing because of limited funds and so forth. And so it's one of the things that we're working now to do, that we're putting this 1983 thing together. One of the steps is to begin to try to recruit attorneys trained in the law schools. Don't understand anything about sustainable development and all that. You go get an attorney there, you get rolled because they don't know what they're talking about. And they go to an old school, and for the most part, there's exceptions. But we want to start training attorneys to how to do this and bring them on board and stuff. So, but I can't tell you a website to go to for that specific thing. Yeah.
Okay, so another word I heard was private prosecution. And can we call our mayors on their oath of office and hold them accountable in that way?
You can start there. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. But I mean, what we're talking about here is an arrogance that they don't care. And that's what you got to get beyond. We got to make them care. That's the bottom line to it. And you make them care by feeling pain. And I'll tell you what, if you can get one or two of a lawsuit that takes them out, or run a campaign and knock them out of office, you'll get the rest of their attention. Imagine your council there, and the head guy who is the total jerk, who's doing everything, and you put everything you've got into a pincer move to take him out in the next election. The other members are going to sit there and go, whoa, and then you'll start to get their attention. The reason you don't have their attention, and the NGOs do, is the NGOs are there all the time, and they make them feel a lot of pain. They make them understand, you're not going to get reelected. We're not going to be behind you if you don't do this. And we're not doing that. That's what we need to do. So, yeah. Thank you.
Sean? Just want to say, last night you mentioned an activist website for people that are activists.
Yes.
I know you weren't sure exactly, but maybe you could mention, because all these
It's
people would...
my friend Pat Wood, we're working together, and he's put together localactivist.org. It is .org. Localactivist.org. He's created it like Facebook, but it is a place for activists to go in. You can set up your own. You could set up your own organization page there, and you can communicate with each other there. Pat is being very adamant to keep the trolls out of there, to keep the guys, he figures it out very quickly who people are, and he's controlling that. But you're able to go in there and meet others, network with others, and communicate with each other. So localactivist.org, I highly recommend you go in there.
The other thing, Tom, you mentioned section 1988 last night.
Yeah, I was talking to an attorney about the section 1983, And he said, well, don't forget 1988. And I said, what's that? I have now dubbed this the attorney recruitment section, because 1988 deals with if you do succeed in filing a suit and winning, 1988 says they got to pay your legal fees. And so this is what the ACLU uses all over the United States to terrorize local communities. And they win lawsuits against them, and then they use 1988 to collect money. That's where they get a lot of their money and how they operate. So you could, as your association, probably do some things like that too. So, yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, Tom.
Wow.
Good job. Thank you very much.
Thank you.